In today's video, we're finishing US 84 by covering Westbound. US 84 is 1,919 miles long, going through Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, New Mexico, and Colorado. At the eastern beginning of US 84, we begin at I-95 and we're signed west for Midway. Just sign Hinesville, it's the larger city. When we meet US 17 in Midway, we're now signed west for Hinesville and Fort Stewart. In Hinesville, we meet Georgia 196 and we're now signed west for Jessup. On the mileage sign, Ludowici is our secondary in 7 miles and Jessup is still our primary in 18. In Jessup, we meet US 341 and we're now signed west for Blackshear. Waycross should be signed instead because it's the larger city. When we reach Blackshear, we meet Georgia 15 and we're now signed west for the correct choice of Waycross. In Waycross, we meet US 82, US 1, and US 23, and we're now running concurrently with all of them signed for Pearson and Tifton, which are both for US 82. When US 84 leaves the mix, we're now signed west for Valdosta. On the mileage sign, Homerville is our secondary in 27 miles, and Valdosta is still our primary in 61. Not long after crossing into Valdosta, we meet US 41 and US 221, and we're now running concurrently with US 221. When we meet I-75, we're now signed west for Quitman. In Quitman, US 221 leaves us, and from it we can see that we're now signed west for Thomasville. East of Thomasville, we meet US 19 and we're now running concurrently with it, and it's signed north for Albany and we're signed west for Cairo. When US 19 leaves us, the control cities are the same. On the mileage sign, Cairo is the only city on it in 17 miles. In Cairo, we meet Georgia 93 and we're now signed west for Bainbridge. When we reach Bainbridge, we meet US 27 and we're now signed for Colquitt and Donaldsonville. Colquitt is for US 27 and Donaldsonville is for US 84. I think Dauphin should be signed instead for US 84 because it's a much larger city. When US 27 leaves us, we're still signed west for Donaldsonville, but we're now also signed for Dauphin. I don't mind Donaldsonville also being signed. At least Dauphin is signed. Also, I don't know which interchange we wanted, but anyways, Quad Roblox requested be interchanged with US 27. In Donaldsonville, we meet Georgia 39 and we're now signed west for Jakin. What happened to Dauphin being signed? Just sign Dauphin. Also, Jakin has a population of 128. Why is it signed? But literally 2 intersections later, we meet Georgia 91 and we're now signed west for Dauphin again. Why is Georgia so inconsistent? But I mean, at least Dauphin signed, I guess. I couldn't find anything in Jakin, but anyways, we're now crossing into Alabama over the Chattahoochee River, and here is the Alabama State welcome sign, and I've never seen this one before, but it is so much better than the other ones in the state. In Dauphin, we meet US 431 and we're now running concurrently with it signed for Eufaula and Montgomery. Eufaula is for US 431 and Montgomery is for US 84 because US 84 meets US 231, which goes to Montgomery. When US 431 leaves us, the control cities remain the same. When we meet US 231, we're now running concurrently with it signed for Enterprise and Panama City. Enterprise is for US 84 and Panama City is for US 231. When US 231 leaves us, we're still signed west for Enterprise. When we reach Enterprise, we're now signed west for Elba. In Elba, we meet Alabama 87 and we're now signed west for Opp. When we meet US 331 in Opp, we're now running concurrently with it signed for Florella, which is for US 331. And here US 331 leaves us, still signed south for Florella. I literally couldn't find anything between Opp and Andalusia, so here we are in Andalusia, which is definitely the next control city. But anyways, we meet US 29 here, and we're now running concurrently with it signed for Bruton, which is for US 29. When US 29 leaves us, it is still signed south for Bruton, and Alabama 55 is now joining us, and we're now signed for River Falls and McKenzie. River Falls is for US 84 and McKenzie's for Alabama 55. We should be signed for Evergreen instead. River Falls literally has a population of 491. Why is it signed? On the mileage sign, they actually fixed this. River Falls is now our secondary in 3 miles and Evergreen is our primary in 30. When Alabama 55 leaves us, it is signed north for McKenzie and Red Level, and we're signed west for Evergreen. Also, why is the K in McKenzie not capitalized? Like seriously? East of Evergreen, we meet US 31 signed north for McKenzie and Greenville, and we're now running concurrently with it signed for Evergreen. In Evergreen, US 31 leaves us signed south for Bruton, and we're now signed east for Monroeville. And also, I have no clue which intersection they wanted, but anyways, Matt Weber requested the US 31 intersection. When we meet I-65, we're still signed west for Monroeville. This exit was also requested by Matt Weber. On the mileage sign, we get 4 cities: Belleville in 6 miles, Repton in 13, Monroeville in 22, and Frisco City in 23. And the city limits of Monroeville and Frisco City don't even touch US 84. Here we meet Alabama 136, which would take you to Monroeville, and we're now signed west for Grove Hill. In Grove Hill, we meet Alabama 295, and we're now signed west for Coffeyville. Just sign Waynesboro, it's the larger city. In Coffeyville, we meet Alabama 69 and we're now signed west for Silas. Once again, just sign Waynesboro for the exact same reasons as Coffeyville. When we reach Silas, we meet Alabama 17 and we're now signed west for Waynesboro. And here we are now crossing into Mississippi. And shortly after that, we get the state welcome sign. In Waynesboro, we meet US 43 and we're now signed west for Laurel. When we reach Laurel, we meet I-59 and we're now running concurrently with it signed for Hattiesburg and Collins. Hattiesburg is for I-59 and Collins is for US 84. When we leave I-59 at exit 95B, I-59 is signed south for nothing and we're only signed for 16th Avenue North. We were also running concurrently with Mississippi 15 for a bit, and when the highway split, we can see that we're signed west for Collins again. In Collins, we meet US 49 and we're now signed west for Prentice, which has a population of 925. Why is this sign? Sign Monticello instead with its population of 1,384. The mileage sign is a little different though, with Prentice on the top line in 18 miles, Brookhaven has the secondary in 57, and Natchez on the bottom line in 117. Unsurprisingly, when we reach Prentice, we're now signed west for Monticello, which is still the correct choice because that last mileage sign was probably a novelty sign anyways. Shockingly, that mileage sign actually wasn't a novelty sign because Brookhaven and Natchez are still the secondary and bottom line respectively, and Monticello is the new top line in 16, although Natchez shouldn't be the actual control city yet because it skips other places that should also be control cities. In Monticello, we're now signed west for Brookhaven, and yet again, Natchez is still the bottom line in now 80 miles, and Brookhaven is still the secondary as well in now 20 miles. When we reach Brookhaven, we meet US 51 and we're now signed west for Natchez as the actual control city. Also, I've made some videos on US 51 that you should check out after this video, linked in the description. Shortly after that, we meet I-55 and we're still signed west for Natchez. When we meet US 98, it is now joining us and we're still signed west for Natchez. Also, US 98 should really just end here because it runs concurrent with other highways for the rest of its length. On the mileage side, when Natchez is actually the control city, it doesn't appear on the mileage sign. Washington is now our control city in 30 miles with Roxy as the secondary in 15, and oh yeah, Washington is unincorporated! Put Natchez back on the freaking bottom line. When we reach the Natchez area, we meet US 61 signed north for Port Gibson and Vicksburg, and it's now joining us southbound towards Natchez. At this intersection, US 61 leaves us signed south for Woodville and Baton Rouge. US 98 ends, and US 425 randomly spawns in and is now running concurrently with us signed for downtown Natchez and Vidalia. The intersection with South Canal Street was requested by At Work Station because Fat Mama's Tamales is located on it. We're now crossing into Louisiana over the Mississippi River. Also, this Louisiana sign is the best thing we get for the Louisiana State welcome sign. I couldn't find anything in Vidalia, but in Faraday, which is definitely the right choice for the next control city, US 425 leaves us and we're now signed west for Jonesville. On the mileage sign though, Jonesville becomes our secondary in 16 miles and Jenna is now our primary in 42. When we meet Louisiana 124 in Jonesville, we're now signed west for Alexandria and Jenna. We don't actually go to Alexandria, but US 84 meets Louisiana 28, which goes to Alexandria. When we meet Louisiana 28, it's signed west for Alexandria and we're still signed west for Jenna. On the mileage sign right after that intersection, Jenna is now our secondary in 13 miles and Winfield was our new primary in 51. I literally couldn't find anything in Jenna, but anyways, in Tullis on the mileage sign, Winfield is now the secondary in 22 miles with Clarence as the new bottom line in 47. In Winfield, we meet US 167 and we're now running concurrently with it through the city. When US 167 leaves us, we can see that we're signed west for Clarence. Also, just sign Natchitoches. It's literally like right there, and Clarence has a population of 321. Why is it signed? In Clarence, we meet US 71 and we're now running concurrently with it signed for Shreveport, which is for US 71. Mansfield should also be on the sign for US 84. When US 71 leaves us in Coushatta, we're now signed west for Mansfield. When we meet I-49, we're still signed west for Mansfield. Like Jenna, I literally couldn't find anything in Mansfield, so here we are crossing into Texas over the Sabine River, and there in the distance you can also see the Texas State welcome sign. In Joaquin, we meet Texas 7 and we're now signed west for Joaquin, referring to its downtown in Tanaja. Rusk should be signed instead because it's the next reasonably sized place US 84 goes through. When we reach Tanaja, we meet US 59 and it's now running concurrently with us signed for Nacogdoches and Palestine. Nacogdoches is for US 59 and Palestine is for US 84. And we also meet US 96 here signed south for Center and Beaumont. When US 59 leaves us, we get no control cities. On the mileage sign though, Mount Enterprise is our secondary in 15 miles and Rusk is our primary in 45. Now one could argue that Palestine should be signed because it's the larger city, but this is a US highway, so signing Rusk is fine. In Rusk, we meet US 69 and we're now signed west west for Palestine again. When we meet US 79 in Palestine, we're now running concurrently with it, signed for Oakwood and Fairfield. Oakwood is for US 79 and Fairfield is for US 84. When US 79 leaves us, it is now signed south for Buffalo and we're still signed west for Fairfield. On the mileage sign though, Fairfield is now our secondary in 24 miles and Teague is now our primary in 34. For consistency, just keep Fairfield as the control city here. In Fairfield, we meet I-45 and we can see that we're signed west for Teague. On the mileage sign, Teague is the secondary now in 8 miles and Mahia is now our primary in 20. Keep Teague as the control city for consistency again, even though Mahia is the larger city. When we meet Farm to Market Road 553, we're signed west for Mahia. In Mahia, we meet Texas 14 and we're now signed west for Belmead, which is a suburb of Waco. Just signed Waco! Luckily, on the mileage sign, they rectified this and Waco is now our primary in 40 miles. Belmead would be fine as a secondary though. When we reach Waco and meet I-35, we're now signed for Waco Drive and Belmead Drive. Here we meet Farm to Market Road 1695, Estates Drive and Hewitt Drive. This exit was requested by Kuwata Roblox. I couldn't find anything else in Waco, but when we meet Texas 317 in McGregor, we're now signed west for Gatesville. When we meet Texas 36, we're now signed west for Evans, which has a population of 458. Why is this signed? Just sign Goldthwaite from here. In Evant, we meet US 281, which is probably why it's signed, but it doesn't justify being signed though. Anyways, we're now signed west for Goldthwaite. When we reach Goldthwaite, we meet US 183 and it's now running concurrently with us, so we're now signed for Brownwood and Comanche. Brownwood is for both highways and Comanche is also for both highways, even though it goes through neither of them, because they meet US 67 and US 377, which go to Comanche. When we meet US 67 and US 377, they're signed north for Comanche and they're now running concurrently with us southbound, signed for Brownwood and Cisco. Brownwood is for US 84, US 67, and US 377, and Cisco's for US 183. When US 183 leaves us, it is still signed north for Cisco, but it is also signed north for Rising Star now. When US 377 leaves us, signed south for Brady, we're still concurrent with US 67, signed for Coleman, which is only for US 84. In Santa Ana, US 283 is now joining the concurrency. Shortly after that, US 67 leaves us, signed south for Ballinger and San Angelo. In Coleman, US 283 leaves us, signed north for Baird and Cross Plains, and we're signed west for Abilene. And on the mileage sign, Abilene is the only city on it in 52 miles. When we reach Abilene, we meet I-20 and we're now running concurrently with it, signed west for El Paso. And considering the size of El Paso, it's fine that US 84 doesn't have a control city here. When US 84 leaves I-20, which is still signed west for El Paso, we're now signed west for Snyder and amazingly Lubbock. If Lubbock is being signed from this distance, it might as well be signed by itself. In Snyder, we meet US 180 and we're still signed for Lubbock, but we're now also signed for Post. Once again, just signed Lubbock by itself. On the mileage sign, Post is our secondary in 46 miles and Lubbock is our primary in 87. When we reach Post, on the mileage sign, Southland is our new secondary in 14 miles and Lubbock is now only 38 miles away. In Lubbock, we meet I-27 and we're now signed west for Littlefield. On the mileage sign in Littlefield, Amherst is our secondary in 8 miles and Muleshoe is our new control city in 32. When we reach Muleshoe, we meet US 70 and it's now running concurrently with us. When we meet Farm to Market Road 1731, we can see that we're signed west for Farwell. Farwell is actually the city right at the border with New Mexico, so we're now crossing into New Mexico. As soon as we cross into New Mexico, US 60 is now joining us. And at that same intersection, we also get the New Mexico State walk-up sign. Also, RV Sphinx supposed to be yellow. On the mileage sign, Cannon Air Force Base is our primary in 15 miles with Clovis as a secondary, which should be the primary in 8 miles. Just have Clovis be on the sign by itself. Strangely, there's a second mileage sign right after the other one with Portales as a secondary in 27 miles on US 70 and Fort Sumner and 68 miles on the bottom line on US 84 and US 60. When we reach Clovis, US 70 leaves us to head towards Portales. When we meet New Mexico 467, we're now signed west for Cannon Air Force Base and Fort Sumner. And 3 miles later, we have the exit for Cannon Air Force Base. In Fort Sumner, US 60 leaves us, signed west for Vaughn, and we're now signed west for Sumner Lake and Santa Rosa. Sumner Lake is literally just a lake. It doesn't need to be signed. Also, it's not even on US 84. On the mileage sign, they double down on the Sumner Lake signage with it being the only control city in 16 miles. Just put Santa Rosa on the sign. And here's the intersection where you can turn left to get to Sumner Lake and Sumner Lake State Park. On the mileage sign right after that intersection, Santa Rosa comes back as the control city and is in 32 miles. When we reach Santa Rosa, we meet I-40 and US 54, and US 54 is now joining us, signed for Santa Rosa along with Business Loop I-40. We meet I-40 a second time in Santa Rosa, and at the exit, no highways are signed, and the only thing that is signed is Santa Rosa. When US 54 leaves us, it is signed west for Vaughn, and we're now signed west for Albuquerque because we are about to run concurrently with I-40. When we meet I-40 a third time, time, it's signed east for Tucumcari, just signed Amarillo, and we're now running concurrently with a westbound sign for Albuquerque. We're also unsigned here, and it's fine US 84 doesn't have a control city here because of how large Albuquerque is. At exit 256, US 84 leaves I-40 signed for Las Vegas, the one in New Mexico, which is fine for US 84. Here we meet I-25 after going through the literal middle of nowhere between I-40 and I-25, and we're now running concurrently with it signed for Santa Fe. Also, sign Colorado Springs northbound for I-25, don't sign Las Vegas. Here US 285 is joining the mix, and we're still signed for Santa Fe. When US 84 and US 285 leave I-25 signed south for Albuquerque, we're now signed for St. Francis Drive and Santa Fe Plaza. Here we meet St. Michael's Drive. This exit was requested by the Times are here. Here we meet Guadalupe Street, and this is going the other way, and admittedly this should have been in the eastbound video, but alas, it is what it is. Anyways, this exit was also requested by the Times are here. When we meet New Mexico 599, we can see that we're now signed for Española. In Española, on the mileage sign, Chama is our new control city in 81 miles, which is on US 84, and so is the secondary Tierra Maria, which is in 66 miles. When US 285 leaves us, we're still signed for Chama. In Tierra Maria, US 64 is now joining us towards Chama. In Chama, we meet New Mexico 17, and we're now signed for Dulce and Pagosa Springs. Dulce is for US 64, and Pagosa Springs is for US 84. On the mileage sign, we can see that Dulce is 27 miles away, and Pagosa Springs is 49 miles away. When US 64 leaves us, the control cities are the same, but US 64 is now also signed west for Farmington. And here's the Colorado State welcome sign as we are crossing into Colorado. There's actually nothing significant in Colorado, so here we are in Pagosa Springs, ending at US 160, signed west for Pagosa Springs and east for Alamosa. This time I've actually decided to do this voiceover. It's gonna be a bit scuffed, but anyways, the control cities for westbound should be Hinesville, don't sign Midway, then Jessup, then Waycross, skip Blackshear, then Valdosta, Quitman, Thomasville, Cairo, Bainbridge, Dauphin, skip Donaldsonville and Jakin, then Enterprise, Elba, Opp, Andalusia, Evergreen, Monroeville, Grove Hill after meeting Alabama 136, then Waynesboro, skip Coffeyville and Silas, and Laurel, then Hadesburg and Collins when concurrent with I-59, then Collins by itself when leaving I-59, then Monticello, don't sign Prentice, then Brookhaven, then Natchez, don't switch to Washington, then Vidalia, Faraday, Jonesville, Jeno, Winfield, Natchitoches, don't sign Clarence, then Shreveport and Mansfield when meeting and running concurrently with US 71, then Mansfield by itself when leaving US 71, then Russ, skip to Naha, then Palestine, Fairfield, Teague, Mahia, then Waco, don't sign Belmead, then Gatesville, Goldthwait, don't sign Evans, then Brownwood, Coleman, Abilene, El Paso when concurrent with I-20, then Lubbock when leaving I-20, don't sign Snyder or Post in Littlefield, Muleshoe, Farwell, Clovis, don't sign Cannon Air Force Base, then Fort Sumner, then Santa Rosa, don't sign Sumner Lake, then Albuquerque when concurrent with I-40, then Las Vegas when leaving I-40, then Santa Fe when running concurrently with I-25, and Española, Chama, and Pagosa Springs. Anyways, if you guys enjoyed today's video, please subscribe. I also have more videos on my channel where I cover more US highways, and I also cover interstates and state highways, and I also look into and review control cities. Anyways, see you guys next time. Bye!